Imagine arriving in a foreign land and witnessing a funeral unlike anything your culture could fathom. A young woman chosen to die alongside her deceased master, paraded, drugged, sexually used, and then killed in a firelit ritual. That is not fiction. It was recorded by a 10th century Muslim envoy, and his account has been confirmed by archaeology. In this video, we uncover what Viking raiders actually did, the brutal sexual practices they used to enforce power, maintain dominance, and shape their world. From battlefield humiliation to wedding night surveillance, their approach to intimacy was anything but private. Please like and subscribe to support the channel and share where and when you're watching. Now step with us into the dark reality of Viking ritual, law, and conquest, where sex was never just sex and nothing about power was subtle. In the year 922, a man named Ahmed ibn Fudlan was sent as an ambassador from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad to the land of the vulgar Bulgars in present-day Russia. His mission was religious and political, but what he witnessed during his journey became one of the most disturbing and vivid glimpses into Viking ritual ever recorded by a non-European source among the Norse raiders and traders who navigated the rivers of Eastern Europe. He encountered a funeral unlike any he had ever imagined, a ritual so intimate, so violent, and so foreign that it haunted him for the rest of his life. Ibn Fedlan described the death of a chieftain, a man of high status among the Norse. His body was laid in a wooden boat to be burned in the traditional way. But before the flames were lit, a slave girl was chosen to accompany him into death. This was not symbolic, it was literal. The girl, according to Fadlan, volunteered, believing she would join her master in the afterlife. What followed was a ritual of public sexuality, intoxicants, and sacrifice. Over the next several days, the slave girl was treated not just as a mourner, but as a vessel, a conduit between the living and the dead. She was passed from man to man, given alcohol to dull her senses, and told by each participant to deliver a message to her master that they had honored him with their act. Each encounter was framed as spiritual, not personal, a communal transfer of life force. On the final day, 6 men took her into a tent built aboard the funeral ship. There they performed final rites with her. Outside, the tribe chanted and drummed. Then came the culmination. An older woman known as the Angel of Death led the girl to her master's body. 2 men held her down while the woman stabbed her under the ribs, and she was strangled with a rope as the blade went in. Her body was arranged beside the dead chieftain. The ship was set ablaze, rising into a sea of fire, smoke, and human sacrifice. For centuries, scholars debated the accuracy of Fedlan's account. Many dismissed it as exaggeration, misunderstanding, or even anti-European bias. But in recent decades, archaeology has provided disturbing confirmation. The famous Osberg ship burial in Norway contained the remains of 2 women, one of them showing signs of possible ritual killing. Other high-status graves in Scandinavia include young female skeletons laid beside powerful men, some with trauma consistent with violence. This was no isolated tale. It reflected a cultural worldview in which sexuality, death, and honor were woven together. To the Vikings, the body was more than flesh. It was a symbol of status, a tool of transition, and at times a weapon. This ritual, shocking as it seems now, was structured. It was sacred, and it tells us something foundational about how the Norse understood power, not just in life, but beyond it. In the Viking imagination, control over sex was not limited to pleasure or reproduction. It extended into ritual, politics, warfare, and the afterlife. And it was always about who commanded, who submitted, and who bore the consequences. In Viking society, sex was never merely a private matter. It was a visible legal and political marker of one's place in the world. A man's sexual behavior, especially his role within it, could determine his honor, legal standing, and survival. Masculinity was not simply assumed. It had to be performed, defended, and proven. And there were strict cultural boundaries around what counted as masculine. One of the most destructive accusations a man could face in the Viking world was being labeled unmanly, not just in demeanor, but in sexual role. To be seen as passive in intercourse, particularly with another man, was to be marked as socially and legally inferior. The active partner retained his masculine identity, but the passive partner was stripped of it entirely. He was no longer considered a full man. In a culture where power and violence were fundamental tools of identity, such a label could be fatal. These views were not just cultural. They were codified into law. Early Icelandic and Norwegian legal texts specify that calling a man sexually passive or accusing him of being used by another could justify a killing. If someone spread such rumors about you and you killed them in response, the courts would not convict you. The insult alone was considered a provocation equal to mortal threat. The consequences extended far beyond dueling rights. A man who was believed to have taken a passive role could lose the ability to testify in court, inherit land, or carry weapons. These were not abstract humiliations. They were concrete legal losses that reclassified a man as weak, dishonorable, and legally suspect. His voice no longer mattered in disputes. His property could be challenged. His place in the community eroded. This rigid sexual hierarchy functioned as a system of control. It created an environment where every man had to prove himself constantly through aggression, physical dominance, and sexual assertiveness. Failing to do so did not merely invite gossip. It threatened his legal personhood. The passive man was no longer a warrior, a father, or a citizen. He was unfit to lead, to fight, or to hold land. In some communities, he could even be denied burial in consecrated ground. The pressure to maintain dominance bled into every part of life. Public boasting, ritual challenges, and coded insults were not just entertainment. They were legal contests of status. To call someone weak in bed was to strip away his legitimacy, and so men retaliated with violence to defend their roles. This was not about private desire or affection. It was about dominance, reputation, and survival. Such laws tell us that Viking society valued control over others as the essence of masculine identity. Penetration was not just sexual. It was symbolic of mastery. The one who penetrated commanded. The one who received was conquered. And in a world ruled by warriors and chiefs, there was no room for the conquered to stand among equals. This system did not exist in isolation. It shaped alliances, marriages, and feuds. It informed the way children were raised, the way justice was carried out, and the way stories were told. The sagas, rich in their detail, often pivot on these moments of insult, injury, and retaliation, where the threat of being seen as sexually inferior sparks a chain of blood and betrayal. Behind the drama lies a stark truth. In Viking law and culture, sex was always about power, and submission was more feared than death. In the Viking world, reputation was not earned quietly. It was declared, defended, and often carved into the bodies of enemies. But perhaps the most dangerous thing a person could wield was not a sword. It was a single, well-placed insult. Words could tear through families, disrupt political alliances, and plunge entire communities into bloodshed. Among all insults, the most lethal were those that questioned a man's sexual performance or his masculinity. Icelandic sagas document feuds that began with a whisper and ended in mass killings. These were not random bursts of violence, but carefully remembered conflicts sparked by accusations of weakness. A man might call another unmanly, hint that he had failed his wife, or suggest he had taken a submissive role in sex. Such words were never taken lightly. To be accused of sexual inadequacy was to be cast out of the warrior class. It marked a man as incapable of defending his family, leading in battle, or even speaking in legal disputes. The saga of Burnt Nigel includes a famous case where an entire feud is launched because one man accuses another of cowardice and femininity. The insult was not made in private. It was shouted in public where others could hear where the accusation would spread. That act of humiliation escalated into a spiral of revenge, with dozens dead before the matter was finally settled in blood. Sexual insults had legal force. Viking law recognized that certain kinds of slander were more damaging than theft or injury. If you called a man unmanly and could not prove it, you faced severe penalties, sometimes including exile or execution. If you could prove it, the insult was no longer slander. It became fact and the man's social position was destroyed. These accusations were not always exchanged between men. Women had their own forms of power in this system. A wife could accuse her husband of sexual failure, and the consequences could be devastating. In one saga, A woman divorces her husband by announcing in public that he was too soft, too gentle, and too slow in bed. Her words not only end the marriage but ruin his standing in the community. Other sagas record wives who destroy reputations with a single taunt, comparing their husbands unfavorably to rivals, or questioning whether they could even satisfy a woman at all. This ability to shame was not a sign of gender equality. It was a reflection of how deeply the society depended on strict codes of masculinity. Men were expected to dominate. If they failed, their failure was not seen as personal, but as political. A weak man endangered his family's honor. He undermined the legal structure that held Viking society together. The pressure to perform, to dominate, and to never show weakness created a feedback loop of aggression. Every insult had to be answered. Every challenge had to be met with force. Otherwise, the entire structure of male authority risked collapse. The sagas are full of these moments, not because they are sensational, but because they were central to life. To insult a man's sexual ability was to set fire to the foundation of his world. And so men killed over words. Families went to war over rumors. And the myth of Viking masculinity was maintained through blood. This weaponization of shame is what made Viking honor so fragile and so dangerous. Masculinity had to be proven constantly, and the cost of failure was social death. It was not enough to fight well or speak boldly. A man had to rule in bed, silence his critics, and ensure that no one dared question his role, not even his wife. To the Vikings, conquest was not limited to land or treasure. It extended into the bodies of their enemies. Sexual violence was not just an act of cruelty, it was a calculated strategy of humiliation and control. Defeating a rival in battle was only the beginning. Breaking him sexually destroyed his identity, his place in society, and his claim to honor. In this system, shame was more effective than the sword. The Saragos and legal codes describe a concept scholars call symbolic penetration. One of the most infamous acts was the deliberate stabbing or slashing of a defeated man's buttock, an action referred to in later accounts as a shame stroke. This was not random mutilation, it was a ritualized act of degradation. The wounds signified that the victim had been violated whether or not actual intercourse occurred. The meaning was unmistakable. You are no longer a man. You are owned. This kind of humiliation left permanent scars not only on the body but on the soul. A warrior who had been marked in this way could no longer return to his home with dignity. He was tainted, sexually conquered in the eyes of his people. Some chose exile. Others took their own lives rather than face the shame. Those who survived often became social ghosts, unable to lead, to marry, or even to speak as equals. But the Vikings did not always stop at symbolism. In some cases, they went further. Accounts from the sagas describe defeated kings and chieftains subjected to sexual assault in public. These acts were not spontaneous. They were organized, often witnessed by others, and designed to make an example. The message was clear. To lose in battle was to lose your manhood, your power, and your right to rule. One saga tells of a captured ruler who was paraded naked, beaten, and then sexually violated before his former followers. The act was not only about punishing him, it was about transferring his masculine essence to the victors. In Viking belief, dominance was not abstract, it was spiritual. By forcing a man into submission, the conqueror absorbed his strength, his spirit, his place in the world. Even gods were imagined within these terms. Loki, the trickster god, was mocked for taking female form and bearing children. Odin, the Allfather, was accused of behaving like a woman when he practiced a form of magic associated with femininity. In Viking myth and ritual, sexual dominance was tied directly to authority, and the line between sacred and shameful was drawn with brutal precision. Sexual violence was also used as a tool of fear. Entire communities surrendered to Viking raiders rather than risk the fate of their captured leaders. The psychological impact was immense. The threat of being marked, not just killed, but unmade as a man, often broke resistance before a single blow was struck. Stories of these acts spread, not as legends but as warnings. They taught that defiance would be punished not only with death, but with dishonor that would follow generations. This use of sexual conquest reveals the cold logic behind Viking violence. These were not aimless acts of barbarity. They were deliberate strategies that fused warfare, shame, and hierarchy. To the Viking mind, power was not secure until it had entered the body of the defeated, leaving marks that neither time nor mercy could erase. The Viking world was built not only on trade and war, but on human bondage. Slavery was a central part of their economy, and the treatment of enslaved people, especially women, reveals the darkest edges of Norse society. While free Viking women could own property, inherit land, and divorce their husbands, enslaved women had no rights. They were objects to be bought, sold, and used, including for sexual purposes. Raiding expeditions across the British Isles, Ireland, and Eastern Europe brought back more than silver and cattle. They brought back people. Archaeological studies estimate that in some Viking settlements, slaves made up nearly one-third of the population. The largest markets, such as those in Dublin and York, were hubs of human trafficking. Captured women were divided among the raiders like livestock, and the most attractive were often reserved for the chieftains or traded at high value. The legal distinctions were stark. Viking law imposed the death penalty for raping a free woman, but for raping a slave woman, the penalty was often a fine, sometimes no greater than the cost of damaging another man's property. If the woman resisted and was killed, the crime was not murder, it was destruction of goods. This dehumanization was not hidden or considered scandalous. It was embedded into the law itself. The sagas mention these practices with chilling normality. One nobleman is said to have kept a harem of captured Irish women, using them at his pleasure and passing them to guests. Another raider brags of his conquests not only on the battlefield, but in the beds of his enemies. These were not moments of passion, but acts of dominance. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women served a purpose: to demonstrate the total power of the free man and to reinforce the helplessness of the enslaved. But the cruelty was not only individual, it was systemic. Children born to enslaved women could be kept as slaves, separated from their mothers, or raised to serve their owner's family. Some slave girls were trained for domestic labor, while others were groomed from puberty to serve as concubines. Their value increased with youth and appearance, and the worst abuses were often hidden behind the appearance of household order. This system also created a hierarchy among slaves. Those who were considered more attractive were more highly valued, but also more heavily controlled. Resistance was met with violence, and obedience was rewarded with relative survival. The absence of legal protection meant that enslaved women had no way to refuse, no right to complain, and no one to defend them. The contrast with the rights of free women is startling. A free woman could sue a man for unwanted touching. She could end a marriage if her husband was unfaithful or sexually inadequate. She could claim her own property and choose her own partner. These freedoms existed precisely because they were denied to others. Viking society emphasized that freedom meant control, not just over your body, but over others. The treatment of enslaved women as sexual property was not incidental to Viking life. It was part of the broader system of conquest, wealth, and social status. Men proved their dominance not only in battle, but in the private sphere through their ability to command, control, and take. For the Vikings, the home was another battlefield, and in that war, enslaved women bore the greatest cost. In the Viking world, marriage was never just a private bond between two people. It was a public, legal, and economic contract, and its fulfillment depended not only on ceremony, but on sexual performance. The union between husband and wife had to be witnessed, consummated, and in some cases, legally verified. A failure in the bedchamber could nullify the entire marriage, cost families their dowies, and bring public shame on everyone involved. Weddings were among the most legally complex and symbolically charged events in Norse society. The rituals were filled with sexual symbolism. One of the most notable involved placing a ceremonial hammer in the bride's lap, a gesture intended to invoke fertility. The hammer represented strength, virility, and divine approval of the union. But the symbolism did not stop there. The ceremony moved quickly from mythic imagery to concrete expectation. Following the ritual, the bride and groom were led to the marriage bed. In many cases, members of the family, sometimes even priests, Bless the bed with chants meant to ensure fertility. What followed was not private. Families were often required to wait nearby to listen for sounds that confirmed consummation had occurred. In more serious arrangements, witnesses remained in the room during the act itself. Their role was to verify that penetration had taken place and that the marriage was legally binding. This was not a symbolic formality. It had financial and legal consequences. If a marriage was not consummated, the bride's family could demand the return of the dowie. If a groom failed to perform sexually, he could be shamed, sued, or in some cases replaced. The law codes specify penalties for sexual failure on the wedding night, framing intimacy not as romance, but as transaction. The morning after, the evidence was often examined. Blood-stained sheets were displayed to prove the bride's virginity and the marriage's legitimacy. These sheets could be kept as legal proof in case of future disputes. If the bride was not a virgin and this had not been disclosed, her family could be accused of fraud. If the groom could not fulfill his role, he risked public disgrace and financial penalty. The marriage bed, in essence, was a courtroom. Saga literature documents examples of family members serving as eyewitnesses to the first night. In one account, a bride's uncle remained present in the room to ensure the act was completed. In another, the mother-in-law waited at the door, listening carefully and asking questions. These moments were not considered perverse. They were regarded as duties, a form of social enforcement to protect property, inheritance, and reputation. Love in this system was a luxury. What mattered was lineage, alliance, and economic stability. A marriage that failed sexually could jeopardize entire family fortunes. Children were expected to result, and the continuity of bloodlines depended on it. Emotions had no place in this calculus. Only function mattered. This emphasis on public confirmation of private acts reflects a larger truth about Viking society. Nothing intimate was ever entirely personal. The body was a tool of law, a marker of honor, and a vessel of lineage. Performance in bed was not just expected. It was watched, measured, and enforced. And failure was not private embarrassment. It was public, binding, and unforgiving. Viking beliefs about the afterlife were not abstract ideals. They were enacted through physical ritual, where sex, death, and sacred violence intertwined. The most vivid of these ceremonies were funerals for powerful men. These events were not quiet farewells. They were communal performances of loyalty, sacrifice, and spiritual transfer. And at the heart of some of them stood a young woman chosen not to mourn the dead, but to join him. The account left by Ahmad Fadlan remains the most detailed description of such a ritual. He described the funeral of a Norse chieftain where a slave girl volunteered to accompany her master in death. But before she died, she became the center of a sacred and deeply physical rite. Over the course of several days, she was honored, groomed, intoxicated, and sexually used by a number of the dead man's companions. Each act was accompanied by a message. Tell your master that I did this out of love for him. They believed this sexual contact transferred energy, the essence of the living into her, so she could carry it to the afterlife. On the final day, her role as spiritual vessel reached its violent end. She was led to the funeral ship where 6 men engaged her sexually one final time. Then inside a small structure on the deck, she was laid beside the dead chieftain. An older woman called the Angel of Death by Fedlin approached her. 2 men held the girl down. The Angel of Death wrapped a rope around her neck while simultaneously plunging a dagger beneath her ribs. As she gasped for breath, she was strangled and stabbed to death in front of the chanting tribe. Her body was then burned with the dead man's believed to accompany him into the next world. This ceremony was not an aberration. While the full details of Fedland's accounts have been debated, multiple graves across Scandinavia provide archaeological support. The Osberg ship burial, dated to the early 9th century, contained 2 women, one of whom shows signs of trauma that may indicate violent death. Other high-status burials include young women interred with powerful men, often in positions or conditions that suggest they were sacrificed. These rituals reflected the belief that sexual energy was a form of life force, one that could be gathered, stored, and transferred. The slave girl became the vessel carrying the desires, power, and essence of the living into the unknown. Her death was not considered cruelty, but devotion. To die this way was, in their eyes, an honor. Yet from a modern perspective, It reveals one of the most extreme forms of sexualized ritual violence in recorded history. Participation in the ritual was framed as loyalty to the chieftain. The men who used her did so as acts of devotion, and the community watched not in horror, but in solemn reverence. These were spiritual obligations, not private indulgences. The destruction of the girl's body was not just an offering, it was a collective act of transformation. In death, she became part of the man she served, ensuring his strength in the afterlife. These beliefs reveal how Vikings understood the link between sex, power, and spiritual continuity. The body was not only a vessel for life, but a bridge to eternity. And for the most powerful among them, the right to claim another's body, even in death, was considered both a privilege and a symbol of ultimate dominion. In the Viking world, power came in many forms. Some wielded it through warfare, others through inheritance, and a few through practices considered dark, dangerous, and unnatural. Magic was one such domain, especially a form known to later scholars as female-coded sorcery. Men who practiced it could access great supernatural influence, but they paid a heavy price in reputation. The Viking view of gender and sex was so rigid that even spiritual authority could not escape its judgment. This form of magic was associated with prophecy, divination, and control over fate. It was often performed by women, priestesses, or spiritual guides whose rituals were accepted as sacred. But when men engaged in the same practices, they were seen as crossing a moral and sexual boundary. To enter the realm of women's magic was to surrender part of one's masculinity. Even gods were not exempt. In the mythic poems, Odin himself is accused by other gods of behaving like a woman for practicing such sorcery. His status as the chief deity did not shield him from mockery. This tension reveals how deeply sexuality and gender roles were policed in Viking society. A man could not adopt what was considered a passive role, not in sex, not in ritual, not even in the spiritual domain. If he did, his power was seen as tainted. And yet men who practiced these rites were also feared. Their connection to the unseen gave them a reputation for danger. They were socially suspect but spiritually potent, walking contradictions in a world that prized clarity of role and purpose. Same-sex relationships followed similar rules. The issue was not the gender of one's partner. It was the sexual role one took. A man who played the dominant part retained his honor, but to be viewed as submissive was ruinous. The act itself was less important than how it was understood within the framework of dominance. Sexuality was not categorized by desire, but by power. Some sagas reference warriors who took both male and female lovers. As long as they maintained control, such behavior was not condemned. In fact, it could be a mark of status, another expression of command over others' bodies. But the accusation of being used, of allowing oneself to be penetrated, was among the most serious insults available. Viking law treated this slander with the same weight as accusations of murder. If the charge could not be proven, the one who uttered it faced deadly consequences. Clothing, voice, behavior, all could become grounds for suspicion. A man who dressed with too much attention to detail or who avoided aggression risked being labeled soft. The boundaries between gender and power were drawn so tightly that even slight deviations invited scrutiny. Men were expected to be assertive, violent, and sexually dominant. Anything else invited humiliation or worse. This system left little room for ambiguity. It forced individuals to conform to narrow standards of conduct or else face social death. Yet it also created an atmosphere of constant anxiety. Masculinity had to be displayed, defended, and reaffirmed endlessly. A man's honor was only as secure as his last performance in battle, in the bedroom, or in the hall. In this context, shame was a weapon. It could be used to destroy reputations, challenge authority, or spark feuds. Whether in myth or law, the Viking world treated masculinity not as a given, but as a status that had to be earned and could be taken away. Magic, sex, and social power were all bound by the same harsh equation. Dominance defined worth, and submission threatened the very core of identity. Justice in the Viking world was not carried out behind closed doors. It was public, theatrical, and often brutal, especially when it came to crimes involving sexual shame. Punishments were designed not only to balance wrongdoing, but to reinforce social hierarchies through humiliation. The guilty were not simply executed, they were displayed, violated, or mutilated in ways that mirrored their crimes and reminded the community who held power. Viking laws included detailed punishments for offenses such as adultery, rape, and sexual slander. But these punishments were not always discreet. A man who committed rape could face public execution that involved sexual mutilation. In some regions, the guilty might be castrated before a crowd, their injuries made visible, so that the symbolic reversal of power was complete. The man who had once asserted himself through violence was now rendered powerless, a lesson to all who watched. In certain sagas, there are references to trials that turned into spectacles. Crowds would gather as criminals were paraded, stripped, and punished in full view of their communities. If a man had violated another sexually, some punishments included public reversal, staged assaults that marked him as the new victim, stripping him of masculine identity and dignity. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were carefully orchestrated performances of justice. Some of the most disturbing accounts involve festivals or communal gatherings where captured enemies were subjected to degrading treatment. Prisoners were forced to perform humiliating acts, often sexual in nature, before being executed. The saga of the JS Vikings, for example, includes stories of such punishments where captives were made to endure staged humiliation as part of public ceremonies. The purpose was not only retribution, but entertainment. Spectators laughed, cheered, and placed wagers as victims were reduced to symbols of shame. Archaeological evidence from execution sites supports this narrative. Remains show signs of ritualized violence, including mutilations that had no practical use in killing, but clear symbolic intent. Bodies were found with injuries to the genitals, buttocks, or mouth, consistent with acts of sexual humiliation. These findings confirm that punishment was about more than justice. It was about reinforcing dominance through spectacle. This normalization of sexual violence as punishment reveals a society that used shame as a tool of governance. Fear of public exposure kept people in line. The threat of humiliation was more powerful than the fear of death. And for the Vikings, justice was not only about restoring balance, it was about performance. Authority was demonstrated through control over the body, both in life and in death. This culture of public discipline extended into domestic life as well. Husbands who failed to control their households could be mocked or even challenged by their wives. A man unable to manage his own family could lose respect among peers. In a world where honor was built on domination, even private failure had public consequences. Ultimately, Viking justice turned the body into a message board. Punishments were written on flesh, visible reminders of where power rested and what happened to those who stepped outside its bounds. This system of law infused with shame and sexuality helped maintain the strict hierarchy of Viking life. And for those on the receiving end, the sentence was rarely just death. It was exposure, erasure, and exile from the very identity that once defined them. The Viking world was shaped by the sword, but sustained by systems of control that extended far beyond the battlefield. At the heart of their society was a code that fused violence, sex, law, and ritual into one unyielding structure. Every relationship, whether between warriors, spouses, or slaves, operated within a framework of dominance. To rule was to command bodies as well as land, and power was measured not just in victories, but in the ability to shape and shatter the lives of others. Sexuality in Viking culture was never simply an expression of desire. It was a language of status. The active role was exalted, the passive condemned. Legal codes enshrined this hierarchy. Saragas celebrated those who dominated and vilified those who yielded. The same body that gave life could be used to enforce death. And every intimate act, whether between lovers, enemies, or masters and slaves, was part of a broader performance of social order. Free women had rights that surpassed those of their contemporaries. In other medieval cultures, they could inherit land, manage wealth, and initiate divorce, but their power only existed in contrast to the absolute powerlessness of the enslaved. Viking society drew sharp lines and reinforced them with terrifying clarity. The dignity of a free woman was amplified by the total degradation of the slave girl. Consent was protected for one and denied entirely to the other. This disparity was no accident. It was engineered to uphold the illusion of balance while hiding the machinery of domination beneath it. Viking sexual violence was not an outburst of cruelty. It was a tool of war. Communities that heard of Viking atrocities sometimes surrendered without resistance, hoping to avoid what had befallen others. The psychological impact of Viking raids was often as destructive as the physical toll. The stories of captured kings, raped brides, and humiliated warriors did not simply terrify. They paralyzed. Viking power extended as much through fear as it did through force. Even in their mythology, the same themes repeated. Gods punished each other through sexual humiliation. Magic blurred gender roles and tested the limits of power. Warriors faced not only the axe, but the shame of being rendered passive, exposed, and broken. These tales were more than legend. They were instruction, a blueprint for how power was to be claimed, defended, and remembered. The legacy of this system did not die with the Viking Age. Its echoes persist in language, law, and cultural memory. The fusion of masculinity with aggression, the fear of shame as social death, and the use of sex to police behavior. These are not just ancient concepts. They shape discussions of gender and power. Even today, the Vikings codified these dynamics into law, told them in story, and carved them into bone. What we see in the archaeological record, in the sagas, and in the legal codes is not a portrait of random savagery. It is the structure of a society that understood the body as a battlefield. Whether through ritual sacrifice, marital law, slave trade, or public punishment, the Norse used sexuality not for pleasure alone, but for domination. And they did so with the same precision they used to build ships, write poetry, and carve their names into stone. This system built on the control of others, flesh was not hidden. It was public, praised, and normalized. It allowed some to rise and condemned others to disappear. And even now, centuries later, its cold efficiency forces us to reconsider how civilizations define honor, how they enforce hierarchy, and how often they use sex as the silent weapon behind the throne. If this opened your eyes to the brutal side of Viking life, give it a like and subscribe for more raw Viking history. Which part of their sexual power rituals shocked you most? The funeral rites, the public shaming, or the use of slaves? Let us know in the comments.